Hey everyone, Zach from the barbellphysio.com and performanceplusprogramming.com, and today I'm going to talk about how I program mobility work for CrossFit athletes. So before we dive into actually how we go about doing that programming, let's talk about why mobility is so important in the sport of CrossFit. If you look at other recreational fitness activities, like if you're going to a regular box gym and doing leg presses and lat pull downs and movements like that, while you are training your body through a lot of range of motion and building strength, you're not training it through usually as much range of motion as we are within the sport and fitness activities of CrossFit. So take something like the overhead squat compared to a back squat, where now we're going to challenge upper back mobility, ankle mobility, shoulder mobility dramatically more. When we look at something like the kipping pull-up compared to a lat pull-down, the kipping pull-up is going to challenge that shoulder mobility's full range of motion a little bit more. And then we go the exact opposite direction with something like the toast bar, where we go through spinal flexion and a lot of hamstring flexibility. CrossFit, more than pretty much any other recreational fitness activity outside of those that really just focus on mobility like Pilates and yoga, is going to challenge your mobility more than other sports. And if you don't have great mobility, you're not going to be able to get into the most efficient positions to lift loads through a long range of motion very, very rapidly. And so that's why the CrossFit population tends to be very focused on improving their mobility if it is a limitation for them. Now, here's a research study that I think is really important for us to understand and appreciate. This one looked at general stretching in sports, and what they found was that general stretching doesn't seem to have that big of an effect on preventing injuries from happening. And I think that's really important for us to recognize there. General mobility isn't important. What the CrossFit athlete really needs to do, and really any athlete in general, is understand the mobility limitations that are holding them out of good positioning and then attacking those specific things. So here's probably my favorite example of that. So we've got two overhead squats over here. The one on the left there, I am really pushing my knees forward, so demonstrating good ankle mobility as I go into an overhead squat. That allows me to keep a fairly upright torso, and you can appreciate that shoulder angle that we have there is nowhere near as dramatic as the other version there with the red lines on it. So if somebody lacks a little bit of ankle mobility, then they're gonna have to lean their torso forward a little bit more when they overhead squat, and then to keep that bar over the middle of their feet, they're gonna have to take their shoulder into a really extreme range of motion. Now, if that person's doing a general mobility program, they're gonna get a touch of ankle mobility, but they're also going to waste their time doing a lot of hip mobility and a lot of shoulder mobility stuff, and they're not going to actually make a dramatic improvement on that overhead squat. So the most important thing that the CrossFit athlete needs to do and recognize when it comes to improving their mobility is they've got to get specific on what their mobility limitations are and not waste their time on those areas that don't need to be addressed. So how do we go about doing that? You need to test your mobility out. And I've got a free resource for you that you can go check out. That is our ultimate mobility checklist. If you go to performanceplusprogramming.com/movements, you'll see mobility tests specific to most of the really important movements that we see in the sport of CrossFit. So at that page, you're just gonna scroll through, you're gonna find, okay, I'm really struggling with my pistol squat, for example. Click the pistol squat, it's gonna take you to a new page. We're gonna talk through the points of performance of what we want to see in somebody's pistol squat, and then the mobility tests that are specific to that. So you can identify and pinpoint exactly what you need to work on and not waste your time. Now, the four most important ones for the CrossFit athlete that I'd recommend you test out no matter what are gonna be your ankle dorsiflexion, your hip rotation, your thoracic spine or your upper back mobility, and your lats. Those tend to be the four most crucial as well as the four most commonly limited things in the CrossFit athlete that is trying to improve their performance. That is step one though. I can't overstate that enough, how important it is to make sure you're working on the right areas. So many athletes out there are working on the wrong area and they're completely wasting their time and seeing no improvements in the functional movement patterns that they care about. So take the time to do that first. After that, let's now get into what you do when you know what your problem areas are. So the thing that so many CrossFit athletes spend a little bit too much time on is going to be foam rolling, lacrosse balling different muscles, or hitting the massage gun. And so this is a systematic review right here that I mentioned in that PubMed ID that you can look up if you want to go a little bit deeper. But here's their conclusion. The effects of foam rolling on performance and recovery are rather minor and partly negligible. Now, don't mishear me here. I am not saying that it is completely worthless to foam roll, massage gun, lacrosse ball, different areas of your body. But what we have to appreciate is that those tools only create temporary improvements in somebody's range of motion. And while it might add a little bit of benefit to static stretching, the really important thing is that we want to combine it with other tools if we're going to use it. And for me, in general, those sorts of soft tissue tools are rather optional when it comes to improving your mobility. There are better ways to go about doing it, but it's not wrong to use it. We just have to appreciate that it's only going to create short-term changes. Now, a couple of things in terms of our use of it. Number one, the research is pretty clear that you don't need a heavy dose of foam rolling to get those temporary benefits. So if you're going to foam roll, in general, I tend to tell people to spend between 30 and 60 seconds per muscle group there. And then again, always followed up with something that's going to have a more lasting improvement on your mobility and your performance, because as a standalone treatment option for your mobility, it really has a pretty poor return on your time investment there. So here's another really cool research review. So this systematic review and meta-analysis, they looked at all of the research that they could find, basically comparing static stretching to resistance training. And their conclusions were pretty cool. There were no significant differences between athletes participating in resistance training and those doing static stretching in terms of their range of motion. I think this is really interesting, right? So we tend to think that if you lack squat depth or if your overhead mobility is not good enough, that means you have to do stretching. And if you're a newer athlete to the sport of CrossFit and maybe your squat depth's not where it wants to be, I don't think that necessarily means that you immediately have to start adding 10 minutes of mobility work to your day every single day of the week. Instead, I think you just spend time lifting. And so often the heavy loads that you're going to be moving, if you're taking it through your full available range of motion, you're going to see your mobility improve just by getting into the gym. Now, if you are somebody that's been in the gym for a while, you've been training through your full range of motion, but you're not seeing things open up more, then of course we do want to add some mobility on top of it. But if you're just getting started and your mobility is not perfect, just give it some time. Just be glad that you're in the gym working and don't feel like you have to have this extra burden of doing a lot more mobility work on top of that. Now, one strategy I really do like is the use of an emphasis on the eccentric muscle contraction during our strength days as a way to improve mobility in those athletes that might be a little bit stiffer. There's research showing that if we lower a weight a little bit slower through its full range of motion, that's going to create a really good stretch and opening up of mobility. So consider that. If your squat depth's not great, go really slow on the way down, pause for a second at your bottom portion, and then come up on those strength days. I don't want you doing that in your Metcon though, because that would obviously greatly change the cardiovascular demands of that exercise. But that is one really easy tactic to use to improve your CrossFit specific mobility without actually having to put aside extra time in your day to work on it. Of course, we've got to talk about static stretching when it comes to improving your mobility. And I want to give you some guidelines on how much static stretching the research tends to support us doing to maximize our range of motion. So 5 to 10 minutes a week of static stretching seems to be the sweet spot when it comes to improving mobility. More than that, according to the research, doesn't seem to have an additive effect. Less than that, it's just not enough of a dose to create the changes that we want to see. So the other thing to consider here is your frequency. And so it seems to be that smaller bouts of static stretching spread out across more days seems to have a slightly better effect. So I really like for my athletes to be stretching 3 to 5 days per week on those areas that they need to improve. But it's also important for us to recognize that static stretching alone does not guarantee changes in somebody's movement patterns. So when I read that, what I'm really thinking of is like, imagine a friend of yours that's been doing yoga for years shows up at CrossFit and you ask them to show you an overhead squat. Now they've got great shoulder mobility, great hip mobility, great ankle mobility, but all of a sudden, like when you try to add all of those together in a coordinated functional movement pattern, they can't demonstrate a great overhead squat. Well, that's because having range of motion in joints and muscles alone doesn't guarantee that you can utilize that range of motion. And so I think that's also important for us to recognize when we start adding mobility work into our routine. Just because we open up range of motion doesn't mean you're going to automatically start using it. Your body's been used to moving in one set movement pattern for a while things are stiff. So when we open up that range of motion, there are really two things that I like to do. Number one, I really like to build strength in that new range of motion. So imagine I open up somebody's shoulder mobility. They've never had more than 160 degrees of shoulder flexion. We spend some time opening that up. Well, now they're not strong in this new range of motion, but they're going to be doing some kipping pull-ups or toes to bars. They're going to be challenging that joint in that new range of motion. I want to spend some time building specific strength in that range of motion so that we're not being vulnerable. We're not opening up more risk of injury because we're not strong in that range of motion. And the other thing that we need to do is tie it into the movement patterns that we actually care about. So I kind of like this three-step process when it comes to improving somebody's mobility. So if we're taking that example of somebody's shoulders that are stiff, maybe as they go overhead, they tend to overextend their back to try to make up for those stiff shoulders. Here's what that rehab protocol, that mobility protocol might look like for that individual. We start out with something like a banded lat stretch. Let's open up that shoulder mobility a little bit. And then we take a lighter band, and that's that middle picture here. This athlete's standing on the band and she's opening her shoulders up. So that band is now challenging her shoulder's ability to get to that new in range while she's also thinking about not overextending that low back. She's keeping midline stabilization on, fighting against that compensation that maybe she's done for a really long period of time. And then we finish it up by actually doing what we really care about, and that's taking a barbell, dumbbells, kettlebells, whatever it is, and pressing that overhead in the functional movement patterns that we actually care about. So I think about it like this. I want to open up range of motion. Then I want to build some isolated strength in that new range of motion, and then I want to integrate that into the movement patterns that I care about. Now, I don't always need 3 exercises for that. A lot of times, something like an eccentric contraction that we talked about earlier can do all 3 of those. Imagine somebody has tight lats. Maybe I have them do some eccentric chin-ups, which will really stretch the lats out, but they're focusing on keeping their abs stiff the entire time. Because they're doing that eccentric and slowly controlling that lowering, they're building strength in the shoulder girdle, so we can hit all 3 things with one exercise. But when I look at somebody's total mobility program, I want to make sure they're getting all 3 of those components in it, not just the static stretching. That's where we're going to get the most bang for our buck, the most long-lasting improvements in our mobility, and the best translation of that into our performance inside of the gym. So that's your outline. I do want to say at performanceplusprogramming.com, we have helped thousands of athletes improve their mobility and move better in the gym with the 8 different mobility programs that we have on our website. We focus, like we've talked about today, on those 3 components, and we also focus a lot more on doing specific mobility plans, not general plans. I want you to spend a month fully attacking your ankle mobility, not a month where you're working on a little bit of everything and making just marginal gains in everything. Let's go after one thing and make as big of a dent in that one thing as we can, and then move on to the next area that we need to focus on. But you can check all of those plans out at performanceplusprogramming.com.